So far as I can remember, they sat me down and stood while I sat. And he said, "Now, do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Well," he said, "if you want a career in science, you better give up this naive faith in God tonight in front of witnesses. Because if you don't, you'll never get anywhere. You'll never make it in science." So that was pressure of a kind I'd never experienced before or since. But I got the courage from above to say to him, "Sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I've already got in my Christian faith?"
Ladies and gentlemen, I've long said that if every Christian and Christian apologist was like our guest today, the whole world would be Christianized. It's the great Dr. John Lennox. It's been too long since we've had him on. Now, for those of you that don't know Lennox, where have you been? He's put out some of the best books in the modern era regarding Christianity. Let me just list a few of them. One of the most recent is 2084. And the AI Revolution. He's also written a book on Abraham called Friend of God. He's written a book on the book of Daniel called Against the Flow. He's written Can Science Explain Everything? 7 Days That Divide the World, Cosmic Chemistry, A Good Return, which is a book about work. He's written a book on the predestination free will issue called Determined to Believe. He's written a book on Joseph. He's written Gunning for God, God and Stephen Hawking, God's Undertaker, Can Science Explain Everything, and several others. And the best thing about John is that as brilliant as he is also as humble as brilliant as he is. And he keeps writing books, ladies and gentlemen. The man is in his early 80s now, and we've got to start by asking the great Dr. John Lennox, all the way from the UK, by the way. John, tell us a little bit about your health. How are you doing?
Well, it's very pleasant to be on your show again, Frank. As is normal, getting into old age, we've had some health problems. And my worst one in the last 12 months was an attack of shingles that developed into a very rare facial paralysis syndrome that really knocked me out completely for 6 months because it was so painful. And I've lost half my hearing through that. And one or two little skirmishes with skin cancer, which is why my head looks like it does at the moment. That's evidence of treatment. But apart from that, I've been very thankful that I'm now back into writing mode. My problems have been nothing like those of my wife, Sally. She's got a very serious back problem with pressure on the spine, which we're hoping will get treated fairly soon, but it's very bad at the moment.
Friends, I want all of you, if you would, to pray for John and particularly Sally at this time. They're dear friends and they're treasures to the kingdom. And John and Sally, you may remember about 10 years ago, you were at our house for New Year's Eve. That was one of the highlights of my life, to have you and Sally over. And I'm hoping at one point we can meet again. I know it's hard when you're dealing with health issues to travel. You're just outside of Oxford, England right now. You've been a professor at Oxford for so many years. You became a Christian as a young man. I don't know if our listeners and viewers would know, John, your testimony. How did you become a Christian? I know you were brought up in a Christian home and your parents were very open to you reading anything, but when did you really say, yes, I'm going to follow Jesus, and how did it happen?
Well, you've summarized it pretty well. My parents were remarkable people in that they were godly people. They were Christians, and they loved me enough not to pressurize me. So what happened to me was that from as far back as I can remember, they made Scripture really interesting. And so my response was, I just responded step by step. And it's very difficult looking back to distinguish what people expected of you and what actually happened to you. But I know, because I'd been taught it very young, that I had to become a Christian, that it wasn't enough to have Christian parents. And the proof of the pudding in the end is in the eating. And I responded and got very interested in the basic question which you have stood for so many years, and that is Christianity actually true? And being brought up in a fairly religious country which was full of violence, it was important for me to do the work that was necessary to establish that in my mind. And when I was young, my father handed me a copy of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and that really started me going, and I've never stopped.
And you actually had the privilege of sitting in on some of Lewis's classes, didn't you?
I did, yes. I went to the last lectures he gave. That was a long time ago. That was in 1963.
Mm-hmm.
And those were the last lectures he gave on the poet John Donne. But I'm very glad I did so, because I could associate listening to him lecture on those topics with his books.
Well, one of Lewis's strengths, as you know, was his analogies, and you have that same gift with analogies. I'm going to ask you about some of those analogies as we go. This is going to be sort of a John Lennox greatest hits show, because I've learned so much from reading and watching you, and how you communicate with general audiences so well. Before we get into that, John, I remember you telling a story about when you were a young man getting into science. You had an older scientist tell you that in order for you to be a scientist, you need to give up on God. Why did he say that, and how did you respond?
Well, he wasn't any older person. He was a Nobel Prize winner.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
And I was at a dinner in Cambridge and just found myself sitting beside him. It was a special dinner. And we started to talk, and I asked him questions about what research had won him the Nobel Prize. And when he described it to me, I then asked him very gently, did any of this research ever lead him to think that there might be an intelligence behind the universe? And he didn't like the question and said, no, it didn't. And rather angrily, he turned away from me and continued talking to the people beside me. So I thought that was the end of it. But at the end of the meal, he said, Lennox, come to my room. And it wasn't an invitation, it was a command. But I went. And he'd also invited several other senior members of the university. And so far as I can remember, they sat me down and stood while I sat. And he said, now, do you want a career in science? I said, yes, sir. Well, he said, if you want a career in science, you better give up this naive faith in God tonight in front of witnesses. Because if you don't, you'll never get anywhere. You'll never make it in science. So that was pressure of a kind I'd never experienced before or since. But I got the courage from above to say to him, sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I've already got in my Christian faith? And he said, well, there's the evolutionary philosophy of Henri Bergson. Well, because I'd read Lewis, I knew what that philosophy was. And he'd chosen a very bad example, because Bergson actually wrote that he would really like to have become a Christian of some kind after the war. So it wasn't a very good choice. And I just said to him, if that's all you have to offer me, I'll stick with what I've got and I'll take the risk. And I got up and walked out.
Wow.
But that did a lot for me, Frank. It actually showed me a dark side to academia and the pressures that people are under, more so today than perhaps then. And I resolved that if ever I got to the kind of position I did in the end get to, in spite of his warning, I would never abuse it in the way he did. And I would try and promote open discussion and witness and allow people to make up their own minds rather than trying to make up their minds for them. So that was the story. And in my little book, Can Science Explain Everything, I have recorded it because it was a significant turning point.
Is this the story where you looked at him and said roast chicken? It
Oh, no,
says
no,
it on the
no.
menu. That's another story. Okay.
That's a completely different story.
Okay. We're going to get to that with Dr. John Lennox right after the break. He's got so many great stories that communicate truth in a very understandable, kind of folksy way, and we're going to go through some of them here in the program. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, on the American Family Radio Network. Website's crossexamined.org. That's crossexamined with a D on the end of it.org. Want to mention I'm going to be in Michigan on the 17th and 18th near Grand Rapids of May. So check that out. And this week, I'm going to be in Honolulu. You can go to our website for more on that, and we will see you back here in just 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. One of my favorite guests of all time, the great Dr. John Lennox, is with us all the way from the UK near Oxford. We're going through some of his greatest hits, just having a conversation about his 70 years of being a Christian and his prolific work. He has 2 more books in the pipeline right now. One of them is his own autobiography that I'll be dying to read as soon as that comes out. I think it's coming out this summer. But John, let's go back to we were talking about your interaction with the Nobel Prize winner who wanted you to give up belief in God. I seem to remember a story where you're having dinner with somebody and you bring up roast chicken. Can you bring that? Can you bring that story up?
Yes, well, that's a completely different situation. But it was a very interesting story. And in fact, I think that you may be interested that we're about to make films of some of those stories.
Oh, great.
But that will be a rather innovative thing.
Mm-hmm.
What it was is that all of my life, I've been very interested in reductionism, and the kind that's believed in by people like Richard Dawkins, so that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. And that's all there is to the universe. And it was at a dinner in the college, which is probably why you remember me telling it. And before we sat down, I was introduced to the person that was sitting beside me. I hadn't met him before. He was a college guest, actually. And I asked him what he was interested in, and he said, well, I'm really into various aspects of biology and biochemistry and so on. And I said, I'm a pure mathematician, and I work in the field of algebra. And he replied by saying, how dreadfully boring. And I could see he meant it. And I said, well, it may be to some people. And possibly that's why I also have other interests. He said, what other interests? Well, I said, I'm fascinated by the big questions of life, some of them that involve science, like, for example, the question whether science can tell us everything or do we need something more? Questions like the status of the universe. Is it created? Or did it simply develop itself? And the status of human life, is it made in the image of God or not? And he said, oh dear. He said, it's going to be worse this evening than I thought, because let me tell you straight, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, and we've got nothing to talk about. And I said, that's wrong, because actually reductionism greatly interests me. And I know 2 or 3 different kinds. Which kind are you? Well, that floored him for a minute or two. And I said, I suspect you're a methodological reductionist. In other words, you have a big problem, you split it into smaller problems and try and solve them first in the hope that they'll give you insight on the big problem. He said, that's right. Well, I do that too. That's a standard way of operating. But he said, it's more than that. I said, I know. I suspect that you are actually a materialistic reductionist. In other words, or an ontological reductionist, that everything that exists can be reduced to physics and chemistry, and therefore there's no space for God and so on. Yes, he said, that's exactly what I am. Well, I said, I'd like to suggest an experiment. He said, what? He said, we're at dinner. I said, yes, but this is Oxford. So I picked up the menu and asked him to look at it, and he read it out, and he said, roast chicken. What's the problem with that? I said, none from where I sit. But just tell me, you see those symbols, you've just read them as roast chicken. How did you work that out? Well, he said, because I've learned English. Well, I said, that's very interesting, because you're a reductionist. Now, let me repeat. Are you? Yes, he said, I am. Everything can be explained in terms of physics and chemistry. Yes. Okay, I said, have a go at this. You explain to me how those marks, which you have read as roast chicken, carry the meaning of a roast chicken. And please do it only using physics and chemistry. And there was dead silence. And the funny thing was, his wife was there beside him and heard this, and she said, get out of that if you can. But the amazing thing was, he didn't try. He said, I have gone into my laboratory every day for the past ever so many years, thinking that could be done. But he said, it can't, can it? Well, I said, you tell me. There's no way in which the meaning can be explained in terms of physics and chemistry. And he asked me where I got that idea. And I said, well, actually, I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. The meaning of the message will not be carried by the physics and ink, Sir John Eccles. Well, he said, I'm relieved that you didn't think of it yourself. But now, I said, here's the interesting thing. You told me a few minutes ago, you were working with DNA. Now, I said it has a linguistic structure in a chemical alphabet, 3.4 billion letters long. Tell me about how that came about. Well, he said it came about by chance and necessity. And I said, just half a minute. The roast chicken you noticed on the page, how did that come about? Well, he said someone must have written it there and had it printed. So it involves a mind, and it's only 2 words, roast chicken. And yet here you look at the longest word we've ever discovered, and you say, no, it's just chance necessity, no mind involved. I said, I think you have a problem. And he did have a very real problem. And actually, I've used that many times with highly intelligent scientists who've just never thought of the nature of language. And it really does explode the mythical materialistic idea that you can reduce everything to physics and chemistry. Because the interesting thing now is, and it's generally recognized, although there are still fights in the scientific area about it, that information is not material. Material carries it, but it's not itself material. Well, to my mind, that is enough to destroy materialism without anything else. So that is the story of the roast chicken. But you could use any words at all, of course, for it.
You have another story, and maybe it was this same gentleman, about the origin of your brain. Can you tell that story?
Yes, well, I can indeed. It really comes from a reflection that I often make publicly when I want to be provocative. And I say, well, Christianity and science can sit very well together. After all, the pioneers of modern science were all Christians of a sort: Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on. But the interesting thing to my mind is that atheism doesn't sit well with science. And they say, what? Isn't it the obvious thing? Well, no, I don't really think it is. And they say, well, why? Well, I say, look, we're having a conversation here, and you do science in your laboratory. What do you do it with? And when we've got away from discussing major machines and all the rest, it ends up that they say that they do it with their brain. Some of them are not prepared to say the mind because they think the mind and the brain are the same thing. I don't, but that's another discussion. I said, okay, you do your science with your brain. Give me a brief history of the brain. Well, it's a product of an unguided naturalistic process. I say, really, and you trust it? I said, seriously, if you knew that your computer was the end product of an unguided process, would you trust it? Now, the interesting thing with that story is that I've always got the right answer to it. They say no. Mm. And I say, I see you have a problem again, because you are effectively not simply shooting yourself in the foot, which can be painful. You're shooting yourself in the brain, which is fatal. In other words, and you're well used to this because the title of your program is circles around that whole idea that it's not faith in science that turns people into atheists. It's credulity and failing to see where science is pointing, because they all trust the mind. They have a fundamental credo that they trust. And Einstein was clever enough to realize that he could not imagine, he wrote, a scientist without that faith, by which he did not mean faith in God. He meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. But that is a wonderful pointer to the existence of God. So I like to make atheists feel a little bit uncomfortable when it comes to their arguments for trusting their brain, which are non-existent, actually.
You do such a good job of it in your books and also in your debates with Richard Dawkins. And friends, you can see those debates on YouTube. Dr. Lennox debated Dr. Dawkins back in 2007, 2008, somewhere in that area. And
yes, you're right.
There's a couple of them. And I also remember you saying, John, and I don't know if this is for public consumption, you can shut me down in a minute if it's not, but you had a debate on the Charlie Rose show that never was aired with Richard Dawkins.
Well, I don't think it's telling tales out of school, because the reason it was never aired has nothing, I think, to do with Dawkins or myself. In fact, Dawkins, in one comment he made to me later, I haven't often been in touch with him, but he was very surprised it hadn't been aired. But my own suspicion, and it may not be fair to Charlie Rose, but he was out of his depth, both with me and Dawkins got really frustrated with that.
Okay, that might have been it.
In the actual recording, and I think he was pulled off the air himself a short time later.
He was. There were other issues involved there, yes. But friends, go look on the internet for the debates between Dr. Lennox and Dr. Dawkins. They're extremely well done, particularly on Dr. Lennox's side. And we're going to have 2 more segments with Dr. John Lennox, so don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And go out and get one of his newer books called 2024 and the AI Revolution. See you in just 2 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to learn how to be an apologist, to present the arguments for Christianity and answer the hardest questions, you want to be a part of the Cross-Examined Instructor Academy, CIA, this summer in Charlotte, North Carolina. Myself, Greg Kokel, Natasha Crane, Elisa Childers, Alan Parr, Richard Howe, Jorge Gill, Brett Kunkel, John Ferrer, Hillary Morgan Ferrer, and others will be your instructors. We have a presenter track and a non-presenter track. Go to crossexamine.org, click on events. You will see it there. Let me get back to my guest, the great Dr. John Lennox, all the way from Oxford in the UK. Dr. Lennox, there's a mistake that I think our culture makes when they think that somehow technological advancement, our better understanding of the natural world, sometimes or somehow disproves the need for God. They think science and God are at odds. What mistake are they making when they say that or think that?
Well, I think they're making a number of mistakes. The first thing to say in general is it's one of the most remarkable historical facts that in the West at least, that modern science actually arose in a Christian cradle. And some of the greatest philosophers who weren't necessarily Christian attributed that to the Christian worldview. And C.S. Lewis summarized North Whitehead's view. Alfred North Whitehead was a famous philosopher. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, that's the first side of it. And it leads to the second side of it. One of the other things that I've pursued for a great deal of time in my life is the nature of explanation. And your question is often put to us in the form, well, science will explain everything, so there's no need for God. And it seems to me to be confusing what explanation actually means. You see, I often put it very simply by means of an analogy. If we have a look at a boiling kettle and ask, why is the kettle boiling? You can argue, well, you can say that there's an explanation, a scientific one, in terms of heat exchange from the gas flame to the kettle, agitation of the molecules making the water agitate and boil. But there's another kind of explanation. The kettle is boiling because I would like a cup of tea at the moment. And even children, I find, can see that those explanations do not conflict. They complement one another. And the interesting thing there is they're both necessary to explain what's going on. Because, and in fact, people have been enjoying cups of tea long before they understood the mechanisms of heat. And I often put my reaction to all that this way. The God explanation no more conflicts with the science explanation than Henry Ford competes with an explanation in terms of physics and automobile engineering for a motor car. You need both explanations. One's a personal agent type explanation, the other is a scientific one. And the big mistake, and you called it a mistake, and it is, it's a serious error, is to adopt a position that is often called scientism. I call it scientific fundamentalism, to bring out the fact that it is a view that admits no exceptions. And it is nonsense, actually, from a logical point of view. I've always been interested in logic of all kinds, but that particular thing, that statement, science explains everything, is not a statement of science. It's a statement about science. So if it's true, it's false. So it's logically incoherent. And in life, we're used to that. There are different levels of explanation. So the idea that genuine science and genuine faith in God conflict is a misunderstanding of the whole business. And you talk about technological advance. The more advanced a thing appears to be, the more likely in our experience we are to attribute it to mind. If you know nothing about painting, you might not see much in a Rembrandt. But if you know a great deal about painting and you can see just how complex that painting is and what genius goes into it, you end up admiring the mind of Rembrandt, not the paint. And one of the sad tragedies to my mind is that we see these wonderful television portrayals of nature. We're admiring the wonders of God's creation, yet he's never mentioned. They're not allowed to point to the existence of God because there's a predetermined scientism that's behind people's rejection of God.
Well, you bring that out in Can Science Explain Everything?
Yes, that's right. I wrote that book to make that as clear as I possibly could. And by the way, I'm writing another book that you don't yet know about, but are about to. And that is a version of that book for young people.
Oh, excellent. Well, I think Can Science Explain Everything anyone can understand. I mean, you're already right at a level that people can understand. This is even going to be for younger. Yeah, this is fabulous. Check the book out, Can Science Explain Everything? There's also another book that's related to that, God's Undertaker. That's the one I have that you wrote.
Well, God's Undertaker, let me explain for the listeners. God's Undertaker has been replaced by a much more detailed book, which is much more up to date, and it's called Cosmic Chemistry. Do God and Science Mix? It's got some of the arguments from God's Undertaker, but it's written much later, much more recently, and I think supplies much more evidence for faith in God than the first book did.
You've also said this, Dr. Lennox, that a lot of people think as we advance in technology, we're closing gaps. We used to think God did this and it was a God of the gap fallacy. But you've pointed out that no, the more we investigate the natural world, the wider the gaps are getting. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, yes. The old argument is, well, I can't explain that, therefore God did it. I don't understand lightning, therefore there must be a God behind it, sparking it up. And then you do a university course on atmospheric physics, and that God disappears. And science does a very good job in getting rid of those gods of the gaps, because they are not genuine. They're not the God of creation. And what I say to it is that there are different kinds of gap. Some scientific advances close gaps and get rid of ancient gods, and they've done a good job on that, especially with the Greek and Roman gods and so on. But some research in science actually makes the gap wider. And for example, research on the origin of life. When in 1953, two people won the Nobel Prize because they sparked off a mixture of what they thought was the prebiotic earth, and they got some amino acids, and they won the Nobel Prize for discovering the origin of life. But they hadn't. I mean, it's a long time since 1953. And the problem has got wider and wider, because what they did not know was that it's one thing to have the amino acids. It's another thing to get them in the exact right order as prescribed by the DNA molecule with its 3.4 billion letters. Now, the point is this. If you go back to the analogy we discussed earlier, the roast chicken analogy, and I said, look, and I asked, I sometimes do, what is the origin of that? Give me a complete explanation of that. Well, they say it's been printed on paper and all this kind of thing. Yes, but is there more to it than that? Yes, somebody wrote it. Somebody thought it in their mind. Now, I said, just hold that for a minute. You're postulating a mind to ultimately account for that statement, roast chicken. Well, isn't that a mind of the gaps? And they always respond, no, it isn't, because the only explanation that makes sense of what we're looking at is the input of a mind. And that is the kind of argument that I think it's important to make. And Stephen Meyer has been very good with others at making this over the years, that seeing that it's information, we have no other evidence that information of that linguistic kind, and that's important, can be generated by natural unguided processes. And so it is not illogical to say it must have been put there by a superior mind, the mind of God.
Yes, it's evidence for an intelligent being. We don't just lack a natural explanation. That appears to be evidence for a mind, as you point out.
Yes,
Dr.
that's
Lennox.
absolutely right.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about Christianity. We got a couple minutes before the next break. As you look back on 70 years of being a Christian, Dr. Lennox, what would you do differently if you knew when you were an early Christian what you know now?
That's a difficult question. I've been very privileged in my life to start off by having very good parents, friends around me, not many, but people that helped develop my mind, and a brilliant mentor, Professor David Gooding. And I suppose what I might have done differently, it doesn't quite answer your question, I'd have started writing earlier on these things, because I found my first book, God's Undertaker, very difficult. And now I consider myself as an author, and I very much enjoy writing. And I just wish that I'd done it earlier. The second thing I wish I'd done, that's in much more recent life, in the early 90s and 2000s, I wish I'd kept a comprehensive diary of all that I experienced in the former Soviet Union and in Ukraine and in Russia, particularly in light of what's going on at the moment.
Wow. Well, we could talk more about that right after the break. You may not know, but Dr. Lennox speaks 5 languages fluently, and I hardly speak English. All right, so here he is, the great Dr. John Lennox. We have one more segment with him, and we'll be back in just a minute. By the way, check his webpage out, johnlennox.org, johnlennox.org. Back in 2 minutes. We're speaking with the always interesting, always well-spoken John Lennox, all the way from the UK. And he has so many great books. One of the more newer books is this book, 2084 and the AI Revolution. I actually wrote a review on this, and I just love this book. I love all of John's books. They're so great, and there's hope at the end of this book. Like, there's hope in all of his books, because he always brings it back to Jesus, which is where it needs to be. Let me ask you a question about that, John, about the resurrection, the center of the Christian faith. It has to be true, otherwise Christianity isn't true. I know this is a really big topic and we can't answer it in just a couple of minutes, but if you just had a couple of minutes with a person and you wanted to show them the best evidence in your mind for the resurrection, what would it be? What would you say?
I think there are 2 kinds of evidence. Mm-hmm. There's, first of all, what I call the forensic approach, going into history, because there's sufficient data in the New Testament to withstand a pretty critical forensic attempt to argue like this. It's the way detectives work, actually, and people who like Agatha Christie will be aware of it. You try to give explanations that make sense. So here is a tomb. It's found empty. Now, how do you explain that? And you run through the different possibilities. Well, if it is genuinely empty, and there seems to be strong evidence for that, how did it get empty? Was it the disciples? But then they were morally upright people, and why would they have given their lives for what they knew to be a lie? Oh, well, maybe it was the Romans took him away, or the high priests, and buried him. Well, if that was the case, they could have produced the body when the disciples announced that Jesus was risen. And in that kind of research, what you're doing is trying to get evidence for the best explanation. What is the best explanation of this? And what is very interesting, although a lot of people don't know it, is that there is evidence from several very reliable non-Christian sources that give us pretty clear accuracy on some of the events that surrounded the crucifixion of the Lord and his resurrection. Even one famous German theologian who really didn't believe in Jesus as the Son of God, but he believed that the resurrection had happened. And what I've tried to do is to be fair and give myself to understanding what's going on. But there's a prior issue for people like me who live in a world of science, and that is this. Many people say, look, you can talk about what you claim to be evidence for the resurrection as long as you like, but I know it's not possible because science has given us the laws of nature. And the laws of nature forbid resurrections, as the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume made very clear. So there's no point in you arguing with me about any particular evidence. So to stand back from that, there are two things that I tried to do, and I've done them in detail, by the way, in my book, Can Science Explain Everything, and in my book, Gunning for God Even More. And that is to point out that science cannot forbid miracles. Our knowledge of the laws of nature is essential if we're going to recognize a miracle that appears to be an exception to it. If we didn't know that people don't normally rise from the dead, then we would see nothing surprising in what happened with Jesus Christ. And once you've cleared that up, that science cannot, by its very nature, prove that resurrections can't happen, then you look at this specific and argue in detail that you feel the balance of the evidence shows that it could happen, and in fact did happen. Now, the final element in it all is my reply to people that say, look, science and Christianity are totally incompatible because, you see, in science you can test things. You can't test anything in Christianity. And I say, who told you that? Because what Jesus claims can be tested. Now, he claims that he has risen from the dead and he now lives in the power of an endless life and can meet you. And he claims that if people are prepared to repent of the mess that they've made of their own lives and possibly the lives of others, sadly, and turn to him and trust him for forgiveness, then things will happen to them. They will receive peace. Well, peace with God is something that is experienced. They will receive freedom from guilt. They will also receive a new life and a new power to live. And when you and I and thousands of others look back at life, we can see the way in which God has worked in our lives. And that is powerful evidence. I often say to people, look, you meet a student, say, who's in despair, whose life's in a real mess, and 6 months later you see them again and they've got a smile on their face and drugs have given way to decent eating and all the rest. And you say, what has happened to you? Where's your joy come from? Well, they say, and they may put it in different ways, I became a Christian, I trusted Christ, etc., etc. And this is why I am like this. Well, when you see that a lot of times, it adds up to being real evidence that not only is Christ alive, he can, through his life, affect our lives. And I often feel that this is a very important element in our preaching of the resurrection. When it was first preached, there was evidence in the lives of the apostles that it really happened and they had been transformed people. Now, that's totally inadequate because this is a seriously important subject. And because it was offered by the early Christians, even when Paul spoke to the philosophers of Athens, that was his main thrust, that the resurrection is evidence to all people, not just to Christians. You see, the Christian trust in the resurrection is created by the evidence. It's not our trust creates the evidence. It's the other way round.
Yes, yes. And the New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers.
That's correct.
We would not even have these documents written by Jews in the first century claiming a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead unless it really happened. They had no motive to make it up. John, I want to end with a great story that you provide. You show that Christianity is all about grace. A lot of people miss that. They think it's just another system of works to keep people in line. And I love the way you illustrate it. You give a story about how you asked Sally to marry you. It's kind of a fictitious story, but it gets the point across. Can you explain that?
Well, yes, because this question comes up when people just say, well, Christianity is a religion like any other. And I ask them, what is a religion? And they say, well, a religion normally consists of some kind of ceremony that gets you in, and then you'll be shown a path, and you try to stay on that path, and there'll be teachers or gurus, etc., to teach you. And you will then come to a final assessment. And if you have succeeded in obeying the rules of the path enough, then you'll be received into whatever it is, heaven, nirvana, etc., etc. And most people will say, yes, that is what I believe, because it's very like a university course, actually. Some ceremony to get in, then you've got professors who teach you, but they cannot guarantee you getting a degree in the end. And the reason for that is it's a merit system. And I say, well, if that's religion, Christianity is not a religion, and people are really puzzled. I say it's not a merit system at all. And there are certain things in life that are like that. And then I tell them that I saw a girl many years ago. We've actually been married 56 years, so it's quite a while. And I said, I'd like you to marry me. Now, the way it'll work is this. Here's a cookbook. And I gave her a very nice cookbook. And there are rules in it for making apple cake. And I say, if you follow these rules properly, let's say for 40 or 50 years, I will accept you. But if you don't, you can go back to your mother. Now, when I say that to an audience, they're roaring with laughter. And I say, what are you laughing about? Because that is the way that many of you at this moment are thinking of God. You would never insult another human being by telling them that your acceptance of them depended on their performance in some other area or other. No, I said, I didn't give her a cookbook, not as a basis for the marriage, but I've given her plenty since, because the very fact that my acceptance of her doesn't depend on it sets her free to learn to cook. And it's so important to get that across. And many people just cannot get it, that salvation, the salvation that Christ offers, is a gift, an unmerited gift. We have to receive it, of course, but we do not earn it. It is not merited. And I remember once talking in an Academy of Sciences in a country a very long way from both you and me. And I explained this on the blackboard, actually, to the scientists. And there was a biologist in the front row.
We got about 15 seconds, John.
Oh, right. And his mouth fell open and he said, if that's true, it was worth your while coming all the way here to say it.
Well, it is true, and we are so blessed to have you on the program, Dr. Lennox. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Goodbye.
That is the great Dr. John Lennox. Check him out at johnlennox.org. He's a blessing. I love that man. Thank you for being with us, friends. We'll see you here next week, Lord willing. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.